emotion that the listeners are feeling in response. But the way in which I wanted to sort of approach this question is by looking at individual differences in empathy. So this trait empathy, so how empathic in general people are, and whether that somehow explains their emotional reactions to music. So the measure that I've used to measure this trait empathies is a measure called the interpersonal reactivity index, which basically measures 4 subscales of this trait, this general responsiveness to the observed experiences of other people. So again, these have the kind of cognitive and emotional components of empathy, as well as this really interesting component, fantasy subscale, which is basically, it measures the tendency to identify with fictional characters in books and movies, and how strongly you kind of transpose yourself imaginatively into these kind of fictional characters. Right, so now to the studies. So this is already something that I did kind of early on, or this is actually the study that got me really interested in this topic, and where I first discovered this association between trait empathy and music-induced emotions. So I just wanted to investigate whether there is any sort of correlation between people's empathy scores and how they evaluate or how they rate their own emotional responses to music. And so the hypothesis is that if music indeed evokes emotions via empathy or related mechanisms, then people with an empathic disposition should be more sensitive or more susceptible to music's emotional effects. So I had the participants listen to 16 excerpts of film music. These were about 1 minute long and expressing different emotions, and I'll just play you short little clips so you get an idea of how they sounded like. So that was a short snippet of the sad example. Happy example. That was a scary one. And a tender one. So there were 4 1-minute examples of each of these 4 categories. And film music was chosen as the kind of the genre or the stimulus material, because we thought that most participants, I mean our participants, they were not musicians, they were just average university students, that this would be a genre that everyone is familiar with, and it's composed for the purpose of evoking certain kinds of strong emotions in people. So that was the rationale. And we had 130 participants listen to this, and they rated on these 7-point scales, first of all, the strength of their felt emotion. So if they felt anything at all, and how strong the emotion was, and how much they liked the music. And then this trait empathy was measured using the interpersonal reactivity index that I showed earlier. And then we just did some very simple correlation analysis, looking at the different subscales of empathy. And we found that the fantasy subscale, so the one which measures your tendency to identify with fictional characters in an imaginative way, it had a positive correlation between the intensity of emotions experienced in response to sad music and also in response to tender music, but not for the other kinds of music. And the fantasy and empathic concern also correlated with liking for sad and tender music. But obviously this is, I mean, we can't really draw lots of conclusions yet based on these findings. I mean, the correlations are not great. They are pretty all right. I mean, you don't get that high correlations in any case when you're looking at individual differences, for example, and try to explain them with like personality traits or things like that. The magnitude tends to be kind of in that range, but still, I mean, we don't know if these correlations, maybe this association only exists on the level of self-report, because the way in which we measured trait empathy was by asking the participants to rate, answer this questionnaire where they had to rate these different statements about how they react emotionally in different situations to others' experiences. So it might just be that people who rated themselves as being very emotionally reactive in this empathy questionnaire, they also rated their emotional responses higher in response to music. So can we say, or how could we find out that this association exists in some other level than just this sort of subjective interpretation or subjective rating of their emotional response? And so I proceeded investigating this a bit more. This is actually quite a recent study that hasn't yet been published, but it's going to be presented in the ICMPC conference in the summer. But basically, I wanted to, again, replicate the findings that I found with trait empathy and emotional responses, and sort of go into a whole different level of emotional response. So not just looking at the subjective experience or the subjective interpretation, but looking at the actual physiological reactions, which are more objective measures of emotional reactivity. So whether empathic participants also had stronger physiological responses to music, which would be indicative of more intense emotional responses. So again, I had 10 music excerpts, which were again from the film music genre. Part of them were same as in the previous experiment. Supposed to be neutral, this music. So again, these examples, they were 1 minute long each, 2 of each of these categories. And we had 54 participants, and they actually gave some more detailed ratings about what kinds of emotions they were feeling. So again, they were these kind of continuous, well, like slider scales. They didn't rate continuously only after the music listening, but they didn't have any steps, these scales. So they rated how sad, how peaceful, how moved, anxious, tender, happy, and energetic the music made them feel, and they could rate as many emotions for each song as they wanted. And in addition, we measured skin conductance and heart rate, or heart rate variability, basically. And again, we used the interpersonal reactivity index to measure trait empathy, and also something called the emotional contagion scale to measure the more automatic form of catching the emotion. So it's just a little bit about the rationale of these psychophysiological measures like skin conductance and heart rate variability. So these are sensitive to many different mental states, and they are quite straightforward to measure, and they have quite a predictable short-lived time course that mirrors the duration of the emotional reaction. And they are best conceived of as kind of being reflective of broad categories like arousal or mental effort. So it correlates, like skin conductance correlates with the activity or arousal dimension of emotions. So the more intense the emotional reaction, the more the sort of skin conductance reactivity you will have. But it doesn't really differentiate between positive and negative emotions. Whereas the heart rate variability, so the amount of variability in certain frequency bands, is actually then related to the positivity or negativity of emotions. So if you have more variability in the high frequency band, that's associated with positive emotions. Right. So we had this kind of design where we had, we had 10 experimental blocks because we had 10 excerpts, but we took a baseline measurement of the physiological responses before each of these musical examples, because it's important, you always have to normalize the measurement because there's a lot of individual variability, for example, in skin conductance. And also throughout the experiment, there might be like a trend where the skin conductance signal sort of just kind of decreases. So you have to normalize your measurements for each of these music examples compared to the previous baseline. So yeah, there was always, in each block, there was a 1-minute baseline, 1 minute of music listening, and then the part where they made their judgments of the emotion that they experienced. So the measurement was only done during the music listening and not during the recording. And the songs were presented in different random order to each participant. Right, so first starting with the rating results. Again, so we found that the trait empathy measure was significantly correlated with overall emotional intensity, so average across all the different music examples. And also the amount of tenderness and peacefulness experienced, again, across all examples. But specifically looking at the sad pieces, we actually find really strong correlations of emotional intensity and being moved in response to sad examples, as well as tenderness and peacefulness evoked by the tender examples. But interestingly, so this is now mirroring kind of the findings of the first study, but additionally we found that empathy correlated with the amount of energy felt in response to happy examples. So here obviously we had a bit more nuanced self-report data and found these kind of additional patterns. But now looking at the physiological data. So the skin conductance signal, it was first separated into the tonic and phasic components. So the tonic component basically just measures your overall kind of level of arousal, and this is a very very slowly varying component, whereas the phasic component, they are these event-related skin conductance peaks or responses. And for analysis purposes, it's best to separate them into different signals. And also the heart rate variability was 4 spectral components of this heart rate variability were extracted from this electrocardiogram signal. And all these physiological measures were normalized for per excerpt using the preceding baseline measurement always. So, just overall just comparing physiological responses to the different music, the overall skin conductance level was significantly higher in response to scary compared to sad and neutral excerpts, which makes a lot of sense. I mean, people were just more intensely aroused by the scary music than the sad music. But now looking at the trait empathy. So the event-related phasic skin conductance activity, that was significantly correlated with trait empathy, but only in response to sad and tender examples. So exactly the same pattern as the self-report. But we also found this high-frequency heart rate variability, which is the one which is associated with positive emotions, a positive affect. And this actually correlated with empathy in response to the happy examples as well. So indicating that empathic participants were actually feeling happier while listening to the happy music. And it might be easier, here's just a little correlation table between the trait empathy, different subscales of trait empathy and the normalized phasic skin conductance responses in response to the different types of examples. So you see that in addition, actually, that there was a negative correlation between empathy and skin conductance activity in the neutral examples, whereas there was a positive correlation in the sad and tender examples. And due to the sample size, only the bolded correlations were statistically significant. But yeah, to end, it seems that there is this consistent pattern emerging from self-reports and physiological indices. So fantasy and empathic concern are positively associated with the intensity of emotions induced by unfamiliar music. And just to give you an idea of the types of statements or items that are used to measure these fantasy and empathic concern subscales, just kind of what do they actually measure? So there's some examples of the fantasy scale. So for example, after seeing a play or movie, I have felt as though I were one of the characters. And then you have to rate this on a scale from 1 to 5, which range from does not describe me at all to describes me very well. And so forth. Whereas the empathic concern scale includes items like I often have tender, concerned feelings for people less fortunate than me, or I am often quite touched by things that I see happen. So, and there were, I think there are 7 items for both of these scales in total in this questionnaire. And it also seemed that empathic people are particularly sensitive to emotions induced by sad and tender music, but also possibly to happy music as well, according to the latest experiment. And it might be that this fantasy component is related to this kind of narrative transportation, also in the case of music listening, that people who score high in this trait, that they tend to engage with music through constructing these kind of imaginative narratives about what the story of the music or what the music is telling about, and so forth. And empathic concern, which is the trait associated with feelings of compassion and tenderness, this also just reflects that indeed if you are inclined to feel these emotions for other people, you also feel that way for music. So you respond with tenderness to music as well, or you have kind of these compassionate feelings for music, it seems. So whether that means that music is able to construct a kind of a virtual person, that maybe remains to be investigated further. But if you have any questions about anything, I'd be very happy to take your questions now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Jonna. I always found your research very interesting, still do. So any questions?
Thank you very much for that very interesting talk. I just have one question. This is regarding the samples of music that you've used in the experiment, where you've used film scores, background scores. So this is just a very general question. So there is a possibility that a film score is inextricably linked to a particular scene. Like for example, in a film like Interstellar, there's a docking scene in the end, and there's a musical score which accompanies the scene. And the moment I listen to that score, I'm reminded of that scene and the visual. And the visual itself might trigger us or induce a certain emotion. So was there any mechanism to sort of ensure that the emotion is induced by the music and not the, the memory is triggered by the music?
Yeah, that's a very, very good question, very important one. So there was actually quite an elaborate process when we were originally selecting these film music examples. So we have another paper where we selected and validated a big data set of musical examples, and sort of the criteria when we were selecting them was to choose films, first of all, that weren't very famous or not so popular, and also selecting clips that were not part of the main theme or like very recognizable parts, and they were also tested for familiarity. So we had people listen to, there were a range of musical examples and they were rated for familiarity as well, and we excluded the ones which were which people thought that they recognized. So, but obviously still, even though people shouldn't recognize these, I mean, we've had instances where people have told us that, oh yeah, I recognized, there was this Lord of the Rings, and although we'd never used Lord of the Rings music, I mean, people still think they recognize a certain movie because obviously the musical language that's used is quite similar. I mean, it's the strength on one hand that it's the musical language is familiar, and there's in that sense little disagreement about the emotion that's being conveyed. People kind of agree. It has a sort of it limits the inter-individual variance in that sense. But on one hand, you'll inevitably have these kind of genre connotations of hearing kind of scary music or kind of horror music type, and the types of scenes that might accompany. But then on the other hand, I mean, it's like that's the case with all music to an extent. I mean, it has its.
That is all right. If a listener is not familiar with a particular scene, and if he's making his own, that's, I think, the effect of music and not memory. Yeah. So thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
The slide where you showed the correlations of fear and different types of music, just 2-3 slides, could you go back?
Yeah, sure.
I just wanted to have a look for a few more seconds.
Sure, I went past a bit quickly,
Because I thought this was related to the experiment that we did yesterday.
No. Petri will present the results of yesterday's study in a moment. Yeah.
Is there any specific methodology to select your sample size?
So you can do this kind of power analysis based on the expected kind of effect size and the sample that you need for that. So indeed, based on the magnitude of correlations that we found in previous studies, we sort of pre-selected a sample size of 60, which we didn't. I mean, we had to exclude some participants because of missing data and stuff. But that you can do that, and we try to do that as well here in this second study.
So I have a question, ma'am. Thanks for your presentation. So when we listen to a music, so how do suppose a person who is gauging the emotions, how do they decide that? Because listening to a song, we have a bulk of emotions. It's not so. How do you decide that such is a prime emotion, the others are the secondary ones? Because according to that, we are going to heal a patient. So there are bulk of emotions, and the possibility is that the same track they will listen and the reaction would change. So how do we rate the emotions? How do we decide? How do we conclude?
Yeah, well, that sort of goes back to the whole psychological construction and kind of meaning making of emotion. I mean, it's not necessarily a very straightforward process, and it's always like, even outside musical contexts, when we are experiencing an emotion and we're trying to make sense of it, we use cues from the environment or the situation to actually understand what the emotion is that we are experiencing. So it might be that in the context of music, we take cues from the expression that we hear in the music to make sense of our own responses. But whether, the question of whether, what's the correct emotion or how reliably we can evoke that, I mean, I think that's very difficult to say because
a person is crying listening to a music. Now you have to find it out whether that's tears of joy or...
Right, yeah.
So,
I mean, I would, if it would be tears of joy, I would call it being moved.
exactly.
Yeah.
Or is it a tears of bliss? Or some past, like you just said, nostalgia.
Yeah.
There are certain things. Now it's hard to gauge them.
Yeah.
Because then only on that basis you are going to tell them something about themselves. So.
I mean, I guess if you